Hello, Zoning for Equity students across the United States. My name is Paavo Munkinen, coming to you from the city of Los Angeles. I teach at UCLA. UCLA is located on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people. I prepared this optional mini lecture for you because I think, for the topic of this course, Zoning for Equity, it might also be useful to see how policy analysts or even economists think about and frame this issue of regulating housing development, or even land use regulations more generally. Policy analysis emphasizes kind of trade-offs or thinking about policies in terms of a cost-benefit framework. And I think developing kind of this shared framework for the potential impacts of different kinds of land use regulation or housing development regulations is useful to kind of discuss what might be a better or worse way of doing it, kind of making the decisions behind the reasons behind decisions clearer, perhaps. Okay, so shall we get started? First, as my colleagues have already discussed, land use regulations and zoning encompass a variety of things, right? So you can start off with rules that restrict use into industrial or farmland or residential, and you can think about things in terms of quality regulations, so mandating that buildings have sprinkler systems or you cannot use lead paint, for example. Density restrictions is obviously something we focus on a lot in this issue of zoning for equity and exclusionary zoning. And density restrictions can come into place through a variety of mechanisms, like minimum lot sizes, open space rules, FAR regulations, setbacks, etc. In a paper that I'll mention later, we talk about process regulations separately from what we call prohibition regulations, like density restrictions. Process regulations are the rules that you have to follow as a developer in order to get a project approved. Then there are other land use regulations like minimum parking requirements or local hire rules that can maybe fit into one of these categories, but often are discussed separately. As I think you'll appreciate by the end of this class, rules governing housing development are a big deal, especially in the United States. I think once you put on these zoning glasses, you will never see cities in the same way again. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 4 different impacts that the academic literature frames with regards to housing development regulations. The first one I think is the most straightforward, right? So if you mandate a certain level of quality, a certain building material that is more expensive than a different building material, you make housing more expensive to build and ultimately more expensive to access, right? So I think this has this direct, clear trade-off between higher quality regulations and higher costs, a trade-off that's often worth it. Especially density restrictions, but other kinds of land use rules shape urban form, so for example, creating segregation, as we've discussed a lot in this class, but also, for example, density restrictions in places where people most want to live usually leads to cities growing horizontally when they could otherwise have grown upward. The third area has to do with the price elasticity of supply. So both density restrictions and complex processes for housing approvals make it more difficult to build new housing when demand increases. So this is something I'll explain in greater detail. And the final one that I'll maybe spend less time on, I think is very interesting, but it's perhaps not such a focus of this course, is the impact on local politics. So if local elected officials have the ultimate power to approve or reject individual housing developments, I think it creates incentives to be corrupt, which is probably not a good thing. And if nothing else, it often creates distrust in the planning process itself. Okay, so the most straightforward one, as I mentioned, is that higher quality regulations that mandate higher quality of new housing makes it more costly, right? So, it's often unclear what is the correct amount of regulation in this case. For example, California recently adopted rules that all new housing has to have solar panels on the roof. Seems like a good idea, adds $20,000 to the price of the new house, right? So, some of these are extremely important, so we can think about fire safety rules that are obviously worth it. And in other contexts, it might not be so obvious, right? So there is often a discussion, in the United States as well, but often in lower income countries where prohibiting low quality housing in cities would limit the access for a lot of people to the opportunities the city provides, people coming from the countryside, for example, or make them have to live extremely far away and become kind of super commuters. So these cases where it's really not clear what the right answer is. Okay, thinking about urban form is a huge topic. In many ways, it's obvious that restricting building heights shapes urban growth. you know, re-emphasizing the point of this class that preventing denser housing in certain neighborhoods restricts who can afford to live there. And when you have a racialized inequality like we do in the United States, it exacerbates segregation by race, right? That we have this extreme form of codified spatial inequality in the United States that is extremely pervasive. Less obvious, perhaps, is that restricting the number of housing units in certain parts of an urban area doesn't mean people just disappear or don't move to that urban area at all, right? So people often will just live further out, right? Further away from the city center. So Washington, D.C. famously restricts building heights such that no building is taller than the Capitol. And as a result, housing just gets built in Virginia and Maryland outside of the district, right? So this has gotten to the point where people think that the federal employees living in Virginia, unable to find a house in DC, actually shifted the state politics. If we look at urban density patterns around the world, we see a very common trend of higher densities in city centers, densities that drop fairly quickly as you move away from the center, what scholars call the density gradient, right? This is a very consistent finding. Scholars have mapped kind of, these graphs show the density on the y-axis and the distance to the city center and kind of a cross-section on the x-axis, right? And we see this pattern all over the place. It's called the density gradient. From Bangkok to Barcelona, it drops as you move away from the city center. Wait, until you get to places like Brasilia. What's going on there? The density in Brasilia actually increases at greater densities, distances from the city center. Well, Brasilia, you might be aware, is famous for its modernist master plan in the shape of an airplane that is a low density core with tons of green space surrounded by a green belt in which nothing can be built. And then on the outside where most of the city lives in high density areas. So the majority of the population lives in these outer areas because of the restrictions on development in the downtown area. If development rules were relaxed in downtown Brasilia, you can bet that the densities would go up a lot. So this graphically is easy to display, right? We have this lighter gray line that's kind of the demand for space at different densities from the distances from the city center, right? So at closer to the city center, there is a greater demand for floor area ratio. In an unrestricted city, you get this curve. In a very restricted city like Brasilia or Washington, D.C., the people are still there. They just pushed out farther from the city center than they would have been. The only other place that these scholars that have looked into it could find where you have this inverted density pattern was Moscow, right? Another famously planned city, and this graph compares Paris density to Moscow. Okay, the third impact of housing development regulation is the indirect impact on affordability through a more inelastic supply curve. So in economics, supply elasticity refers to the responses of suppliers of the good to increases in demand, to shifts in demand, right? So with an elastic supply is something like pens, right? If everyone wants more pens, there's a big shift. The supply will activate and be able to increase the production of pens, and prices may go up a little bit, but probably won't go up that much. What will increase is the production. For inelastically supplied goods like Bitcoin or gold, right? The people want more of it and the price just goes up. So we can think about what determines how elastic or inelastic a goods supply is. And kind of then there's a couple of different factors that determine this elasticity. Two of the main ones are discussed as the availability of inputs, right? So if we think about the inputs to housing, we have all the building materials. We also have the land that's zoned for more housing, right? So it's not just land existing, it's land on which more housing can be added. Then another big one that scholars emphasize is the complexity of the production process. So if the production process is very complex, supply will be more inelastic, right? In this case, we can think about these process regulations on housing development. Okay, so here's a basic model of a market with prices on the y-axis and quantities on the x-axis. Supply in this model is relatively elastic. We can see kind of how demand shifts outward from time 0 to time 1. And what happens? Well, prices go up a little bit by 2%, but the quantity of housing produced goes up by more, by 6%, right? This is like a Houston or a Tokyo where the rules governing land housing production are relatively relaxed. And when people want more of it, it's built. Then we can compare this to a more regulated city, Los Angeles, if you will. where when demand shifts outward, building happens, right? There's some new quantity housing produced, but what is more likely to happen is prices are going up. In this case, by 6 and by 2, right? Of course, reality is more complicated than these made up numbers, but the empirical evidence on this topic, right, at the metropolitan or regional level is quite solid and has been around for a while. Expansionary cities like Houston add housing, prices increase slightly. Heavily regulated cities on the coast, right, see limited housing unit growth and large price increases. In fact, as I'll rant about later, California is almost the lowest housing producing state in the United States per capita, in spite of the fact that we have a booming economy. There is demand. This is a graph that shows it wasn't always like this, right? I'll discuss it more in the official lecture for the class, but you can see that California back in the day built a lot of housing. Over time, an increase in the constraints on the rules, unavailable land zone for more housing, discretionary reviews for every project. Now we're building at levels like recessions. You know, in our current economic boom, we're building as much as we did in past recessions. Okay, last but not least, I want to propose that in many cases, restrictions on housing development also mess up local politics, right? I think there's this kind of vicious cycle that has developed with more and more discretionary power in the hands of local elected officials on individual projects in the United States, right? So, you know, one or a few city council members can decide whether the project moves forward. And what that does is creates opportunity and incentive for direct corruption on the one hand, but even if there's not actual corruption happening, you know, it creates distrust and a perception of corruption. As in the case of Los Angeles, we have both, right? So we have both distrust of kind of what are the planners doing behind closed doors, and we have actual council members indicted and arrested by the FBI for taking envelopes of cash, right? So at least 2 of our city council members are in jail. You know, in LA, we have 15 council members that run their districts similar to like with the level of power that Chicago alder people do, you know, the queens or kings of their districts, and it doesn't work out well in terms of local politics. You know, and also, you know, the fact that developers are the major campaign contributor in local elections is, I mean, the local elections in the United States have a lot of problems, and this doesn't help. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend this paper by my colleagues, Michael Manville and Tanner Osman. You know, they argue that many zoning rules are pretextual, which means they function kind of only to be a barrier to development happening that needs to be bargained away, right? So it's a block that requires developers to come to the city in order to remove that block. And then this negotiation happens, you know, and I think it's you know, in the case of Los Angeles, a lot of these are just rules that were never changed from the past, but perhaps some of the newer rules are pretextual in their enacting. I also highly recommend this conversation with one of your co-instructors for this class, Dr. Minji Kim, with Mike Manville and Shane Phillips about her work on schedule-based versus negotiation-based approvals processes. I think it's a great article. I recommend it, but also the conversation is excellent. Okay, so quick recap. The idea of this mini lecture was to frame the impacts of housing development regulations kind of in their different types and their different impacts, to give you some tools to think about the costs and benefits. I think there are some clearly good rules on one end, right? Like not using lead paint or using fire retardant roof tiles. They make housing more expensive, but they're very much worth it. Other rules like density restrictions, on the other hand, minimum lot sizes, I think are pretty clearly not a good idea, right? There's more negative impacts than positive impacts. They make housing expensive, increase segregation, and produce environmentally destructive sprawl. Then there's some regulations in the middle, right, that should be considered one by one and debated and disagreed upon in a public forum. I hope it was useful and interesting. Any questions, feel free to get in touch with me, but I'll see you later in lectures about state level planning systems. Thanks. Have a good day.